The dust kicked up around Adelaide Thompson's worn boots as she stumbled off the stagecoach in Eureka Springs, Arkansas, her wrists still bearing faint marks from the ropes that had bound them during the long journey from St. Louis. It was the spring of 1878, and the small town nestled in the Ozark Mountains looked nothing like the prosperous city she'd been promised in the contract she'd signed 6 months ago, when desperation had driven her to accept any offer of employment that came her way. The madam who'd purchased her contract stood waiting with a painted smile that didn't reach her cold eyes, and Adelaide felt her stomach twist with the realization that the seamstress position she'd been promised was nothing more than a cruel lie. "Welcome to the Silver Spur, girl," the woman said, her voice sharp as broken glass. "I'm Miss Henrietta, and you'll address me as such. You owe me 3 years of work to pay off your passage, your room, and your board. The contract's ironclad, signed and witness proper in St. Louis. You try to run, and the law will bring you right back to me." Adelaide's throat tightened as she clutched the small carpet bag that held everything she owned in the world. She was 21 years old, an orphan since fever had taken her parents 2 years prior, and she'd thought herself so clever when she'd signed that contract without reading the fine print. The other women who emerged from the building behind Miss Henrietta wore rouge and revealing dresses, and their eyes held a mixture of pity and resignation that made Adelaide want to weep. "I was promised sewing work," Adelaide said, her voice trembling but defiant. "The contract said seamstress." Miss Henrietta laughed, a harsh sound that scattered the chickens pecking in the dusty street. "Oh, you'll sew plenty, girl. You'll mend the sheets and the dresses and whatever else needs mending. But you'll earn your keep the way all my girls do. Now get inside before I have someone drag you." Adelaide's mind raced with panic and fury. She'd fled St. Louis to escape poverty, only to find herself trapped in something far worse. The town of Eureka Springs bustled around them with late afternoon activity. Prospectors and cowboys and merchants going about their business, none of them sparing a glance for one more desperate woman being led into the Silver Spur. That first night, Adelaide refused to leave the small room they'd shoved her into. She pushed the rickety chair against the door and sat on the narrow bed, her whole body shaking with fear and anger. Through the thin walls, she could hear music and laughter and sounds that made her cheeks burn with shame. When Miss Henrietta pounded on the door near midnight, Adelaide shouted back that she wouldn't do it, that the contract was fraud, that she'd rather starve. "You'll change your tune soon enough," Miss Henrietta snarled through the door. "No food, no water, until you come out ready to work proper." The second day passed in a haze of thirst and hunger. Adelaide examined every inch of the room, looking for escape, but the window was barred and the door solid despite its shabby appearance. She tried to think of some solution, some way out, but her mind kept circling back to the brutal reality that she had no money, no friends, and nowhere to go even if she could escape. The contract gave Miss Henrietta legal ownership of her labor for 3 years, and breaking it would land Adelaide in jail or worse. On the third day, Adelaide's lips were cracked, and her head pounded from dehydration. She was considering whether prison might actually be preferable to this when she heard shouting downstairs, followed by the sound of breaking glass. Heavy footsteps came up the stairs, and then Miss Henrietta's voice rose in protest. "You can't just barge in here. This is a respectable establishment." "Respectable," a man's voice, deep and rough with barely controlled anger. "You've got women locked in rooms, Henrietta. I've heard the stories, and I'm here to see for myself." Adelaide stumbled to the door, pressing her ear against the wood. She heard more voices, more arguing, and then footsteps approaching her room. Someone knocked, gentle but firm. "Madam, If you're in there and in trouble, say so now. My name's Cole Anderson, and I'm here to help if you need it." Adelaide's voice came out as a croak. "Water, please, I need water." "Break it down," Cole said to someone else. And then there was a tremendous crash as the door burst inward, the chair clattering aside. Adelaide found herself looking up at a tall man in his mid-20s, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of a summer sky. He wore dusty ranch clothes and a Stetson that he pulled from his head as he stepped into the room, his expression shifting from anger to concern as he took in her condition. "Jesus," he muttered, then turned and shouted down the stairs. "Ben, bring water now." Cole crossed the room in 2 long strides and knelt beside Adelaide where she'd collapsed back onto the bed. His calloused hand touched her forehead, checking for fever, and his touch was surprisingly gentle for such a rough-looking man. "How long?" he asked. 3 days, Adelaide whispered. "No food or water since I arrived. I refused to work because the contract was a lie. They said seamstress, but it's not sewing they want." Cole's jaw clenched, a muscle jumping beneath the stubble that covered his cheeks. "Henrietta's going to jail for this. Can't treat people like property, contract or no contract." "The contract's legal," Adelaide said, despair flooding through her. "Signed proper in St. Louis. 3 years of labor to pay my debts." A younger man appeared in the doorway with a canteen, and Cole took it, helping Adelaide sit up enough to drink. The water was the most wonderful thing she'd ever tasted, and she had to fight the urge to gulp it down too fast. "Easy now," Cole said softly. "Small sips or you'll be sick." When Adelaide had drunk enough, Cole handed the canteen back to his companion and stood, his expression thunderous. "Where's this contract? Miss Henrietta has it. In her office, I think." Cole turned and strode from the room, leaving Adelaide with the younger man, who introduced himself as Ben Carter, Cole's ranch hand. Ben was perhaps 19, with an earnest face and kind eyes. "Cole's a good man," Ben said. "Best rancher in the county, and he can't stand injustice." When he heard about women being forced to work at the Silver Spur against their will, he came straight to town. "Been looking in every room." Adelaide could hear shouting downstairs, Cole's voice rising above Miss Henrietta's protests. Then there were more footsteps, and Cole returned with a folded document in his hand. He crossed to the window where the fading sunlight still filtered through, and Adelaide watched as he read, his frown deepening with each line. "It's fraud," he said finally. "Says here you owe $800 for passage, room, and board. The stage from St. Louis costs maybe $30, and you've been here 3 days. This is extortion dressed up as a contract." "But it's signed and witnessed," Adelaide said, her brief hope flickering and dying. "The marshal will enforce it. I have nowhere to go and no way to pay." Cole looked at her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. Then, to Adelaide's shock, he gripped the contract with both hands and tore it cleanly in half. The sound of ripping paper seemed impossibly loud in the small room. "The contract is destroyed," Cole said, his voice quiet but firm. "You're free." Adelaide stared at him, unable to process what had just happened. "But the law says contracts obtained through fraud are void," Cole interrupted. "And even if it didn't, I just destroyed the only copy. Henrietta can try to enforce a contract that doesn't exist." He tore the halves again and again until the contract was nothing but scraps, which he let fall to the floor like snow. "You're free," he repeated. "No one owns your labor. No one owns you." Tears spilled down Adelaide's cheeks before she could stop them. She'd been so certain she was trapped, so sure there was no escape, and now this stranger had simply torn up the document that bound her. It seemed too easy, too good to be true. "I have nowhere to go," she said through her tears. No money, no family. I came west because there was nothing left for me in St. Louis. Cole exchanged a glance with Ben, then looked back at Adelaide. My ranch needs help. I've got 2,000 acres of cattle and horses, and my housekeeper just left to live with her daughter in Little Rock. I need someone who can cook, clean, and mend clothes. Actual sewing work. I pay fair wages, $30 a month plus room and board. You're free to leave whenever you want, and the only contract will be your word and mine. Adelaide searched his face for any sign of deception, but all she saw was genuine concern and perhaps a flicker of something else. Interest, maybe, or curiosity. He had saved her, this cowboy with the summer sky eyes, and now he was offering her a lifeline. Why? She asked. Why would you help me? Cole was quiet for a moment, turning his hat in his hands. My mother died when I was 12, he said finally. Left my father to raise me and my 2 sisters alone. He remarried a few years later, but before that, we saw how hard life could be for women with no protection and no resources. My sisters are grown now, married and living in Kansas City, but I remember how scared my father was that something would happen to them. When I heard about Henrietta forcing women to work here, bringing them in on fraudulent contracts, I couldn't stand by and do nothing. It wasn't a declaration of romantic interest, but it was honest, and Adelaide found herself wanting to believe him. She was exhausted, frightened, and alone, but something in Cole Anderson's steady gaze made her feel safer than she had in months. I accept, she said. I'll work for you and I'll do good work. You won't regret this. I know I won't, Cole said, and he smiled for the first time, transforming his stern face into something warmer and more approachable. The next hour was chaos. Miss Henrietta screamed and threatened, calling for the marshal and swearing she'd have Cole arrested for theft and destruction of property. Cole stood his ground, explaining calmly that he'd witnessed a woman being starved and held against her will, and that he had several other witnesses who'd testify to Henrietta's practice of bringing women to Eureka Springs under false pretenses. By the time the marshal arrived, a small crowd had gathered, including 3 other women from the Silver Spur, who timidly came forward with their own stories of deception and mistreatment. The marshal, a weary-looking man named Tom Fletcher, listened to all sides and finally declared that he'd be launching an investigation into Miss Henrietta's business practices. In the meantime, Adelaide and the other women were free to go where they pleased. Miss Henrietta's face went purple with rage, but there was nothing she could do as Adelaide climbed into Cole's wagon, her small carpetbag in her lap. The ride to the Anderson ranch took nearly an hour, following a winding road up into the hills. Ben rode alongside on his own horse, occasionally pointing out landmarks and telling Adelaide stories about the area. Cole was quieter, focused on driving the wagon, but Adelaide was intensely aware of his presence beside her. How long have you had the ranch? She asked, wanting to break the comfortable silence. 6 years, Cole said. My father died and left it to me when I was 19. It was smaller then, just 500 acres and a couple dozen head of cattle. I've built it up since, buying more land when I could, increasing the herd. It's good country for ranching, plenty of water and grass. And you run it alone. I've got Ben and 3 other hands. We hire on extra help during roundup and branding, but mostly it's just us. The house is big, too big for one person really. My father built it thinking there'd be lots of children, but after my mother died, he never had the heart to fill it proper. Adelaide nodded, watching the landscape roll by. The Ozarks were beautiful in a rugged way, all wooded hills and rocky outcroppings, very different from the flat farmland she'd known in Missouri. Spring was well advanced here, with wildflowers dotting the meadows and leaves fully unfurled on the trees. When they finally reached the ranch, Adelaide's breath caught. The house was indeed large, a two-story structure built of local stone and timber, with a wide porch that wrapped around three sides. Behind it stood a big barn, several corrals, and various outbuildings. Cattle grazed in the distance, and she could see horses in one of the nearer pastures. "It's beautiful," she said softly. Cole looked pleased. "It's home. Come on, I'll show you inside." The interior of the house was surprisingly well maintained for a bachelor's residence. The furniture was solid and practical, the floors swept clean, though Adelaide immediately noticed details that spoke of a lack of feminine attention. The curtains were serviceable but plain. There were no flowers or decorative touches, and a layer of dust coated the higher surfaces. "Your room is upstairs," Cole said, leading her up the wooden staircase. "There are 4 bedrooms up here. I use the one at the front, and you can take whichever of the others suits you. They're all empty right now." Adelaide chose a room that faced east, with windows that would catch the morning sun. It held a bed, a dresser, a washstand, and a comfortable-looking chair by the window. After the tiny cell at the Silver Spur, it seemed impossibly spacious and welcoming. "Thank you," she said, turning to face Cole. "I don't know how to properly express my gratitude. You saved me from something terrible, and now you're giving me work and a place to stay. I won't forget this kindness." Cole looked uncomfortable with her thanks, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Just do your work honest and we'll call it even. I expect you're exhausted, so rest tonight and you can start in the morning. I'll bring you up something to eat." He left before Adelaide could respond, and she sank onto the bed, her body suddenly feeling the full weight of the past 3 days. She was free. The word kept echoing in her mind, almost too precious to believe. She was free, and she was safe, and tomorrow she would begin earning honest wages doing honest work. True to his word, Cole returned shortly with a tray bearing bread, cheese, cold chicken, and a glass of milk. Adelaide ate slowly, savoring every bite, and then washed her face and hands in the basin of water he'd also provided. She didn't have a nightgown, just the clothes she'd traveled in and one other dress in her carpet bag, but the bed was so comfortable and clean that she hardly cared. Within minutes of laying down, she was asleep. The next morning, Adelaide woke to sunlight streaming through the windows and the sound of roosters crowing. For a moment, she was disoriented, then memory flooded back and she sat up, relief washing through her. She was at the Anderson Ranch. She was safe. She dressed quickly in her spare dress, a simple cotton garment in faded blue, and braided her honey-colored hair back from her face. Her reflection in the small mirror over the dresser showed a thin woman with large hazel eyes and a determined set to her mouth. She looked older than 21, hardened by loss and struggle, but there was hope in her eyes now that hadn't been there before. Downstairs, she found the kitchen and immediately set to work. The stove was still warm, suggesting Cole had been up early, and she found eggs, bacon, and flour in the pantry. By the time Cole came in from the barn, breakfast was ready: scrambled eggs, fried bacon, biscuits, and coffee. Cole stopped in the doorway, surprise clear on his face. "You didn't have to start working already." "I wanted to," Adelaide said simply. "You've done so much for me. Let me do this." They ate together at the long wooden table, the silence comfortable rather than awkward. Cole ate with the single-minded focus of a man used to hard physical labor, putting away an impressive amount of food. "This is good," he said finally. "Real good." Mrs. Henderson was a fine cook, but she was getting on in years and her recipes were getting repetitive. "I'll do my best to keep things interesting," Adelaide promised. "My mother taught me to cook, and so, We didn't have much, but she believed in doing things properly. After breakfast, Cole showed Adelaide around the rest of the house, pointing out what needed attention. There was mending in a basket in the corner, floors that could use a good scrubbing, windows that needed washing. Adelaide made mental notes, already planning how to organize her work. "I'll be out with the cattle most of today," Cole said. "Ben and the others will be around if you need anything. We usually come in for lunch around noon and dinner at 6. If that doesn't suit, we can adjust." "That suits fine," Adelaide assured him. Cole lingered a moment longer, as if wanting to say something else, then settled his hat on his head and headed for the door. Adelaide watched him go, noting the way he moved with an easy confidence, comfortable in his body and his place in the world. She found herself wanting to know more about him, this cowboy who had torn up her contract and set her free. The days settled into a routine. Adelaide rose early, prepared breakfast, and then tackled the various household tasks that had been neglected. She scrubbed floors until they gleamed, washed windows, mended clothes and linens, and experimented with different recipes to keep the meals interesting. Cole and his ranch hands always ate with appreciation, and Adelaide found satisfaction in their evident enjoyment. Cole himself remained something of a mystery. He was unfailingly polite, treating Adelaide with respect and ensuring she had everything she needed, but he maintained a certain distance. He didn't talk much about himself, though Adelaide learned bits and pieces from Ben and the other ranch hands. Cole was known throughout the county as a fair man, tough but honest in his dealings. He'd had a woman he'd been courting a few years back, but she'd decided ranch life wasn't for her and had married a banker in Little Rock instead. "Nearly broke his heart," Ben confided one day when Adelaide brought lunch out to where the men were mending fences. "He was planning to propose, had bought a ring and everything. Then she just up and left, said she wanted an easier life than what a ranch could provide." Adelaide felt a pang of sympathy. She watched Cole work, noting the way he handled the horses with gentle firmness, the way he listened when his men spoke, the way his face softened when he looked out over his land. He loved this ranch, that much was clear, and it must have hurt to have the woman he loved rejected in him. A week passed, then two. Adelaide settled into life at the ranch, and her body began to recover from the ordeal in Eureka Springs. She put on some weight, the circles under her eyes faded, and she found herself humming while she worked. The other ranch hands were friendly, treating her like a little sister, and Ben in particular seemed determined to make her laugh with his terrible jokes. But it was Cole who occupied her thoughts more and more. She found herself watching for him, listening for his footsteps, looking forward to meals when they could sit together and talk. He'd begun to open up a little, sharing stories about the ranch and his plans for the future. He wanted to expand further, maybe start breeding horses in addition to cattle. He talked about his sisters, his voice warm with affection, and the childhood adventures they'd shared. Adelaide shared her own stories too, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. She told him about her parents, her mother's gentle wisdom and her father's terrible singing voice. She described the little house in St. Louis where she'd grown up, the neighbors who'd been like family, the devastation when the fever came and took first her father, then her mother, leaving Adelaide alone in the world. "That's when I made the mistake of signing that contract," she said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "I was so scared, so desperate. I knew I couldn't afford the rent on my own, and I had no trade, no skills that anyone seemed to value. When the agent came around with the offer of work out west, it seemed like the answer to my prayers. I should have read it more carefully." "You were vulnerable and someone took advantage," Cole said quietly. "That's not your fault." It's Henrietta's fault for being a predator, and the fault of a society that leaves women with so few options. Adelaide looked at him, surprised by the vehemence in his voice. "You sound like a suffragist." Cole shrugged. "My mother believed women should have the vote and the same opportunities as men. She was ahead of her time. My father loved her for it, even when their friends thought her ideas were scandalous." He paused, then added softly, "I think if she'd lived, she would have liked you." The words sent warmth flooding through Adelaide's chest. She didn't know quite what to say, so she simply smiled, and they sat together in companionable silence as the sky turned from gold to pink to purple. It was Ben who first pointed out what Adelaide had been trying to ignore. They were in the kitchen, Adelaide rolling out pie dough while Ben sat at the table supposedly polishing tack but mostly just talking. "He's different since you came," Ben said suddenly. Adelaide kept her eyes on the dough. "What do you mean?" "Cole, he smiles more, talks more. Before, he was always so serious, so focused on work. Now he actually takes time to sit on the porch in the evenings. He whistles sometimes when he's working. I think he's sweet on you." "Don't be silly," Adelaide said, but her heart was beating faster. "He's my employer. He's just being kind." "If you say so," Ben said, clearly unconvinced. "But I've known Cole for 3 years, and I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you." Adelaide wanted to ask how Cole looked at her, but she was afraid of the answer. The truth was, her own feelings were becoming increasingly complicated. She was grateful to Cole, certainly, but it was more than that. She found herself drawn to him in ways that had nothing to do with gratitude. She liked the sound of his laugh, rare though it was. She liked the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. She liked his hands, calloused and strong but surprisingly gentle. She liked everything about him, and it terrified her. She'd been at the ranch just over a month when the storm came. Spring storms in the Ozarks could be fierce, and this one rolled in fast, turning the afternoon sky black and unleashing torrents of rain. Adelaide secured the windows and doors, then started preparing dinner, expecting the men to come in soaked and hungry. Cole was the last to arrive, dripping water all over the floor. He'd been out checking on some cattle in the far pasture and had gotten caught in the worst of it. His shirt was plastered to his body, and his hair was hanging in his eyes. "You need to get into dry clothes before you catch your death," Adelaide scolded, already moving to grab towels. "Yes, madam," Cole said with a hint of amusement, accepting the towels and heading upstairs. He returned in dry clothes just as Adelaide was serving dinner. The storm had intensified, wind howling around the house and rain hammering against the windows. Thunder boomed overhead, making the walls shake. "It's a bad one," Ben observed. "Haven't seen a storm like this since that tornado came through 2 years back." "Let's hope we don't get a tornado tonight," one of the other hands said nervously. They ate quickly, the storm making everyone uneasy. After dinner, the hands retreated to the bunkhouse, dashing through the rain, but Cole remained in the house, standing by the window and watching the storm with a frown. "Something wrong?" Adelaide asked, coming to stand beside him. "Just worried about the cattle," Cole admitted. "And the roof on the south barn. It's been needing repairs, and a storm like this could tear it right off." As if in response to his words, there was a tremendous crash from outside. Cole cursed and grabbed his coat. "Stay here," he ordered Adelaide, then plunged back out into the storm. Adelaide watched him go, her heart in her throat. She paced the kitchen, unable to sit still, listening to the storm rage. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, unable to stand it any longer, she grabbed a shawl and ventured onto the porch. The rain was a solid sheet of water, the wind so strong it nearly knocked her off her feet. She could barely see anything, but then lightning flashed and she spotted figures near the barn. She made out Cole's form and relief flooded through her. Then she saw the tree. It was one of the big oaks near the barn, and the wind was pushing it, its roots tearing free from the saturated ground. It was falling directly toward where Cole stood. Adelaide didn't think. She ran, screaming Cole's name, her voice lost in the wind. She collided with him just as the tree came down, her momentum knocking them both sideways. They hit the muddy ground hard, and Adelaide felt the rush of air as the massive trunk crashed down inches from where they'd been standing. For a moment, they just lay there in the mud, both breathing hard. Then Cole rolled, pulling Adelaide with him so he could see her face. "Are you insane?" he shouted over the storm. "You could have been killed, so could you?" Adelaide shouted back. "I saw the tree falling and I just reacted." They stared at each other, both covered in mud, rain pouring down on them. Then Cole did something Adelaide never expected. He cupped her face with both hands and kissed her. It was fierce and desperate and achingly tender all at once. Adelaide kissed him back with all the emotion she'd been suppressing for weeks, her hands fisting in his wet shirt. The storm raged around them, but she barely noticed, lost in the sensation of Cole's lips on hers, the strength of his arms pulling her closer. When they finally broke apart, both gasping, Cole pressed his forehead to hers. "You saved my life," he said, his voice rough. "You saved mine first," Adelaide replied. "In Eureka Springs. You tore up that contract and set me free." Adelaide, Cole seemed to struggle with words. "When I first saw you, I just wanted to help. But these past weeks, having you here, getting to know you. You're brave and kind and strong, and you make me want to be better. I'm falling in love with you. No, I've already fallen. I'm in love with you." Adelaide felt tears mixing with the rain on her face. "I love you too," she said. "I've been trying not to because you're my employer and I didn't want to presume, but Cole, I love you so much." He kissed her again, slower this time, savoring it. When they broke apart, he was smiling, a real genuine smile that lit up his whole face. "We should get out of this storm," he said, "before another tree falls on us or we both catch pneumonia." Hand in hand, they ran back to the house, laughing like children despite the danger and the storm. Inside, Adelaide built up the fire while Cole changed clothes again. When he came back downstairs, she was wrapped in a blanket, her wet dress draped over a chair to dry. "Come here," Cole said softly, and Adelaide went to him, letting him pull her into his arms. They stood like that for a long moment, just holding each other, listening to the storm outside and the beating of each other's hearts. "What happens now?" Adelaide asked eventually. Cole pulled back enough to look at her. "Now I court you properly," he said. "I take you to church socials and town dances. I buy you pretty things and write you terrible poetry. And when enough time has passed that no one can say we rushed into it, I ask you to marry me. That is, if you want all that." "I want all of that," Adelaide said, happiness bubbling up inside her. "Though maybe skip the terrible poetry." Cole laughed, and the sound was the most beautiful thing Adelaide had ever heard. The storm passed during the night, leaving the world washed clean and sparkling in the morning sun. The fallen tree had damaged part of the barn, but it was nothing that couldn't be repaired. Cole assembled his men and explained that he and Adelaide were courting now, so everyone needed to treat her with the respect due to the future Mrs. Anderson. Ben whooped with joy and slapped Cole on the back. "About time, boss. We were all wondering how long you two were going to dance around it." "You all knew?" Adelaide asked, blushing. "Madam, everyone knew except maybe you two," one of the older hands said with a grin. Word spread quickly through the county. The next Sunday, Cole drove Adelaide to church in his best wagon, both of them dressed in their finest clothes. Adelaide wore a dress she'd made herself from fabric Cole had insisted on buying her in town, a soft green cotton that brought out the color of her eyes. The congregation was curious and welcoming. Several women approached Adelaide after the service, introducing themselves and inviting her to join their sewing circle. One was Sarah Mitchell, a warm-hearted woman in her 30s who owned the dry goods store in town. "We're so pleased Cole has found someone," Sarah said kindly. "He's a good man, but he's been alone too long. And after what you went through at the Silver Spur, well, everyone's just glad to see you landing on your feet." Adelaide was surprised. "Everyone knows about that. Honey, this is a small town. Everyone knows everything. But don't you worry. We all know it wasn't your fault. Miss Henrietta was run out of town 2 weeks ago, and good riddance. The marshal shut down the Silver Spur for operating under fraudulent practices." The news brought Adelaide satisfaction. She'd worried occasionally that Henrietta might cause trouble, but apparently justice had prevailed. The weeks that followed were the happiest of Adelaide's life. Cole courted her with a combination of earnest devotion and cowboy awkwardness that she found utterly charming. He brought her wildflowers from the meadows and took her riding to show her the most beautiful spots on the ranch. They had picnics by the creek and long conversations on the porch. He told her his dreams and fears, and she shared hers. One evening, about 2 months after that first kiss in the storm, they were sitting by the creek watching the sun set. Cole had been quieter than usual all day, and Adelaide could sense nervous energy radiating from him. "Adelaide," he said finally, turning to face her. "I know we agreed to wait, to do this proper, but I can't wait any longer to ask you something." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. Inside was a ring, delicate gold with a small diamond that caught the dying light. "This was my mother's ring," Cole said, his voice thick with emotion. "My father gave it to her when they married, and she wore it every day until she died. It's the most precious thing I own, and I want you to have it. Adelaide Thompson, will you marry me? Will you be my wife and my partner and the love of my life?" Adelaide's vision blurred with tears. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Cole, I'll marry you. Nothing would make me happier." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. Then he kissed her with a tenderness that made her heart ache. They were married 6 weeks later in the little church in Eureka Springs, with half the county in attendance. Adelaide wore a dress of ivory silk that she'd sewn herself, with lace at the collar and cuffs. Cole wore a new suit that he'd ordered special from Little Rock, and when he saw Adelaide walking down the aisle on Ben's arm, since she had no father to give her away, his eyes filled with tears. The ceremony was simple and beautiful. They exchanged vows in voices that shook with emotion, promising to love and cherish each other all their days. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Cole kissed Adelaide with such joy that the congregation burst into applause. The reception was held at the Anderson Ranch, with tables set up in the yard and enough food to feed an army. There was music and dancing, and Adelaide found herself whirled from partner to partner, everyone wanting to congratulate the bride. But her eyes kept seeking Cole, and every time their gazes met across the crowd, she felt a jolt of pure happiness. As the sun began to set, Cole claimed her for a dance, pulling her close as someone played a slow waltz on a fiddle. "Happy," he murmured into her hair. "Happier than I ever dreamed possible," Adelaide replied. "When I stepped off that stagecoach in Eureka Springs, I thought my life was over. I thought I'd made a mistake I could never recover from, and now look at us." "You saved yourself," Cole said firmly. "You refused to give up even when things looked hopeless. I just tore up a piece of paper. Everything else you did on your own." "We saved each other," Adelaide corrected. You gave me freedom and I gave you love." "Best trade I ever made," Cole said, and kissed her again as the stars began to appear overhead. Their wedding night was tender and sweet, both of them nervous but eager. Cole was gentle with Adelaide, taking his time, making sure she felt safe and cherished. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the big bed that had once been his alone, talking quietly until they drifted off to sleep. Life settled into a new rhythm. Adelaide was no longer the housekeeper but the rancher's wife, and she threw herself into the role with enthusiasm. She expanded the vegetable garden, started raising chickens, and learned to ride well enough to help with some of the ranch work. Cole taught her to handle a rifle, insisting she should be able to protect herself if necessary. They worked side by side, building their life together. Cole consulted Adelaide on major decisions about the ranch, valuing her opinion and sharp mind. Adelaide suggested they start a small orchard, and Cole immediately ordered fruit trees. She proposed hosting a barn dance to thank their neighbors for all their help and support, and Cole enthusiastically agreed. The first year of their marriage flew by. There were challenges, of course. A hard winter tested the cattle herd, and they lost more animals than Cole had hoped. A dry spring meant less grass and more worry, but they faced everything together, and somehow that made even the difficulties bearable. It was in the early summer of 1879 that Adelaide began to suspect she might be pregnant. She missed her monthly courses, and certain smells that had never bothered her before suddenly made her nauseous. She waited another week to be sure, then told Cole one evening as they sat on the porch watching the fireflies. "Cole, I think I'm going to have a baby." Cole went very still. Then he turned to her, his face a mixture of awe and joy and fear. "Are you sure?" "Not certain, but fairly sure. I thought we could ride to town tomorrow and I could see the doctor, just to confirm." Cole pulled her into his arms, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. "A baby," he whispered. "Our baby. Adelaide, you've made me the happiest man alive." The doctor confirmed the pregnancy the next day, estimating Adelaide would give birth sometime in January. Cole immediately went into protective mode, trying to prevent Adelaide from doing any heavy work and worrying constantly about her health. "I'm pregnant, not made of glass," Adelaide finally said, exasperated but touched by his concern. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time." "I'll be fine." Still, she had to admit it was nice to be so thoroughly cared for. Cole made sure she had plenty to eat, that she rested when she was tired, that she was comfortable. He read to her in the evenings from the newspaper and books he borrowed from neighbors. He talked to her belly, telling their unborn child stories about the ranch and making plans for the future. The months passed peacefully. Adelaide's belly grew round, and she felt the baby move inside her, little flutters at first, then stronger kicks. Cole would place his hand on her stomach and grin with wonder when he felt the baby move. In late December, unseasonably warm, Cole's sisters arrived from Kansas City to help with the birth. Martha and Catherine Anderson were both older than Cole, in their late 20s and early 30s, and they swept into the ranch like friendly tornadoes, bringing energy and laughter and a wealth of practical advice. "Our little brother finally settled down," Martha teased, hugging Cole tight. "We were beginning to think he'd be a bachelor forever." "And you," Catherine said to Adelaide, taking her hands warmly. "Thank you for making him happy. We can see it in his face. He's lit up from the inside." Adelaide liked Cole's sisters immediately. They were warm and funny and capable, and they treated her like family from the first moment. They shared stories about Cole as a boy, embarrassing tales that made him blush and Adelaide laugh. He once tried to bring a baby calf into the house because it was cold outside, Martha revealed. Mother was not pleased. Or the time he decided to dam up the creek and flooded the vegetable garden, Catherine added. I was 9 years old, Cole protested, but he was grinning. The baby came on a cold January night, 3 weeks later than the doctor had predicted. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Adelaide was certain she couldn't endure another minute. But Cole was there, holding her hand, wiping her brow, whispering encouragement. You can do this, he kept saying. You're the strongest person I know. Just a little more, sweetheart. I'm right here. Finally, as dawn was breaking, Adelaide gave one last exhausting push and heard the most beautiful sound in the world, her baby crying. The midwife they'd brought in from town held up the infant, checking it over quickly. It's a boy, she announced. A healthy baby boy. Cole was crying, tears streaming down his face as he looked at his son. The midwife cleaned the baby and wrapped him in a soft blanket, then placed him in Adelaide's arms. Adelaide looked down at the tiny face, the miniature hands curled into fists, the dark fuzz of hair on his head. She felt a surge of love so powerful it almost hurt, a fierce protectiveness and wonder that this perfect little person was theirs. He's beautiful, she whispered. Just like his mother, Cole said, kissing her forehead. You did so well. I'm so proud of you. They named him James Thomas Anderson after both of their fathers. Little James was a good baby, healthy and strong, with his father's blue eyes and his mother's stubborn determination. Cole was a devoted father from the first moment, taking to the role with the same dedication he brought to everything else. Adelaide watched her husband hold their son with such tenderness, and she fell in love with him all over again. This was the life she'd never dared to dream of, the family she'd thought lost forever when her parents died. And it had all begun with a torn contract and a cowboy who told her she was free. The years that followed were full and rich. James grew into a lively toddler, running around the ranch and getting into everything. 2 years after James was born, Adelaide had a daughter they named Rose Elizabeth, a calm baby with Adelaide's hazel eyes and Cole's smile. 3 years after that came another son, William Cole Anderson, called Will from the start. The ranch prospered under Cole's management and Adelaide's contributions as well. She'd proven to have a good head for business, keeping meticulous records and suggesting innovations that increased their profits. They added the horse breeding operation Cole had always dreamed of, and their animals became known throughout Arkansas for their quality. Ben eventually married Sarah Mitchell's daughter Emma, and Cole made him a full partner in the ranch. The two families became close, their children growing up together. The other ranch hands came and went over the years, but Ben remained a constant, loyal and hardworking and a true friend. Adelaide stayed in touch with the other women who'd been at the Silver Spur. 2 of them had married local men, and one had opened a successful dress shop in Eureka Springs. They'd formed their own kind of sisterhood, supporting each other and helping other women who found themselves in difficult situations. On their 10th anniversary, Cole surprised Adelaide with a trip to Little Rock, their first real vacation since they'd married. They left the children with Martha and Catherine, who'd come down from Kansas City, and spent a week enjoying the city. One evening, as they walked along the Arkansas River, Adelaide thought back to that day in Eureka Springs, when she'd stepped off the stagecoach frightened and alone. "What are you thinking about?" Cole asked, noticing her expression. "Just remembering," Adelaide said. "Remembering the day you tore up that contract and told me I was free. It was the moment my whole life changed." Cole stopped walking and turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "You changed my life too," he said. "Before you came, I was just going through the motions, running the ranch, existing. You taught me how to live again, how to love again. We were both so lost." Adelaide said softly, "and somehow we found each other." "No somehow about it," Cole said. "It was meant to be. You were meant to be mine, and I was meant to be yours. Everything else was just the path that led us to each other." He kissed her then, with all the passion and tenderness of their first kiss in the rain, and Adelaide felt the same joy and rightness she'd felt on their wedding day. They returned to the ranch refreshed and happy, gathering their children into their arms and falling back into the comfortable rhythm of their life. The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own joys and challenges. James grew into a serious boy who loved the ranch and dreamed of running it himself one day. Rose was imaginative and artistic, always drawing or making up stories. Will was the daredevil, constantly climbing things he shouldn't and giving his mother heart palpitations. Cole's hair began to silver at the temples, and Adelaide found laugh lines around her eyes, but they both agreed they'd never felt younger. They still had their evening ritual of sitting on the porch, watching the sunset and talking about everything and nothing. They still reached for each other in the night, their passion mellowing but never fading. They still found ways to make each other laugh. When James was 15, he asked his father about the story of how his parents had met. They were working together, mending fence, and Cole told him the whole tale. The fraudulent contract, the silver spur, the moment he'd torn up the paper that bound Adelaide to 3 years of servitude. "You just destroyed it?" James asked, amazed. "Weren't you worried about the legal consequences?" "I was more worried about doing what was right," Cole said. "Sometimes the law and justice aren't the same thing. Your mother was being held under false pretenses, starved and threatened. I couldn't stand by and let that happen. Mother says you saved her life." "And she saved mine," Cole replied. "In more ways than one. Before your mother came, I was half alive at best. She brought light and love and purpose back into my world. Tearing up that contract was the easiest decision I ever made." James thought about this for a moment. "I want to be like you when I grow up," he said finally. "Strong and fair and willing to do the right thing even when it's hard." Cole felt his throat tighten with emotion. "You're already well on your way, son." As the children grew older, they gradually learned the full story of their parents' meeting and courtship. They loved hearing about the storm and the falling tree, the proposal by the creek, the wedding that half the county attended. It became a family legend, a story told and retold until even the youngest could recite the details. "And Daddy tore up the contract and said you're free," Will would say dramatically. "And then they fell in love and got married and had us." "It was a bit more complicated than that," Adelaide would say with a smile, but she was pleased that her children understood the significance of that moment. They'd grown up knowing that their mother had faced hardship and overcome it, that their father had stood up for justice even when it wasn't easy or safe. In the summer of 1895, 17 years after Adelaide had arrived in Eureka Springs, the family gathered for a celebration. James was about to leave for agricultural college, preparing to come back and help run the ranch. The whole county had been invited, and the yard was full of people, tables groaning with food, children running everywhere. Cole found Adelaide in the kitchen, taking a moment of quiet before returning to the party. He came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Happy?" he asked, the same question he'd asked on their wedding day. "Always," Adelaide replied, leaning back against him. "Though I can hardly believe our baby is old enough for college." "Time passes quickly when you're happy," Cole observed. "Feels like just yesterday you were the skinny, scared woman I found locked in that room at the Silver Spur." "I was never that skinny," Adelaide protested, and Cole laughed. They stood together for a moment, comfortable in the silence and the warmth of each other's presence. Then Rose appeared in the doorway. "Mother, father, people are looking for you. They want to toast James before he leaves." Adelaide and Cole joined the party, standing with their arms around each other as Ben raised his glass. "To James Anderson," Ben said, "may you be as good a man as your father and as strong a person as your mother. And to Cole and Adelaide, who have shown us all what true love looks like. May your years together be many and your happiness never end." "Hear, hear," the crowd chorused, raising their glasses. Adelaide felt tears prick her eyes. She looked around at the people gathered in her yard, friends and neighbors, people who'd become family over the years. She looked at her children, all three of them healthy and happy and loved. And she looked at Cole, her husband, her partner, the man who'd set her free and then captured her heart. "I love you," she whispered to him. "I love you too," Cole replied. "Today, tomorrow, and always." The years continued to unfold in their gentle rhythm. James returned from college with new ideas that he and Cole implemented together, making the ranch even more successful. Rose married a teacher from Little Rock and moved to the city, but she visited often and wrote letters full of her adventures. Will decided to become a veterinarian, driven by his love for animals and his desire to help people like his father had always done. Cole and Adelaide grew older together gracefully, their love deepening with each passing year. They became grandparents, delighting in James's children and eventually Rose's as well. They watched their legacy grow, both in the thriving ranch and in the family they'd created together. On their 25th anniversary, the whole family gathered again. The children were grown now, some with children of their own, and the celebration was bittersweet with the knowledge that time was passing and nothing lasted forever. But that evening, as Cole and Adelaide sat on their porch watching the sunset, their hands clasped together, they both felt the peace that comes from a life well lived and love fully given. "You ever regret it?" Adelaide asked suddenly. "Taking in a strange woman with nothing to offer but her labor and her gratitude." Cole turned to look at her, his blue eyes still as bright as they'd been the day they met, though now framed by wrinkles and topped with silver hair. "Regret," he said. "Adelaide, you were the best thing that ever happened to me. You gave me love, family, purpose, joy. You took a lonely cowboy and made him whole. How could I possibly regret that?" "I just wanted to be sure," Adelaide said, smiling, "because I have no regrets either. Even the hard parts, even the scary moments in Eureka Springs, I can't regret them because they led me to you." "The contract said you must work," Cole said softly, echoing the words that had changed their lives. "But I tore it up and said you're free, and in freeing you, I freed myself. I freed us both to choose each other, to build this life together." "Best decision you ever made?" Adelaide asked. "Best decision we ever made," Cole corrected. "You chose to trust me to come to the ranch to give us a chance. That took courage." They sat in silence for a while, watching the sky turn from gold to pink to purple, the colors they'd watched together countless times over the years. The ranch was quiet around them, peaceful and prosperous. Inside the house, their children and grandchildren laughed and talked, the sounds of family and love. "Cole," Adelaide said eventually, "thank you." "For what?" "For seeing me, for helping me, for loving me, for giving me a life beyond my wildest dreams." Cole raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "Thank you for the same, and for saving me from that tree." Adelaide laughed. "We do have a habit of saving each other, don't we?" "That's what love is," Cole said. "Saving each other over and over in big ways and small." As the stars began to appear overhead, Adelaide leaned her head on Cole's shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart, the warmth of his body against hers. She thought about the frightened girl who'd stepped off the stagecoach so many years ago, alone and trapped and hopeless. That girl could never have imagined this life, this love, this profound contentment. The contract had said she must work, bound her to years of servitude and suffering. But Cole had torn it up and set her free. And in that freedom, they'd both found something far more precious and binding than any contract. They'd found love, true and deep and lasting. The evening deepened around them, the ranch settling into nighttime quiet. Cole's arm around Adelaide's shoulders, Adelaide's head on Cole's chest. They sat together as they had for 25 years, and would for as many years as God granted them. Two people who'd saved each other, who'd built a life and a family and a legacy together. The contract was long gone, destroyed that night in Eureka Springs. But the freedom it represented, the choice they'd made to love each other, remained as strong and true as the day Cole had first said those life-changing words, "You're free." And in that freedom, they'd found everything.